The letter arrived without a return address, written on paper so old it seemed to exhale dust when unfolded. Its edges were brittle, yellowed like tobacco-stained parchment, and the ink, faded brown, bore the kind of cursive hand that had disappeared from the modern world. James Holler, journalist for the Nevada Sentinel, stared at it for several minutes before he even opened it. He wasn't sure why. Something about the postmark, Reno, Nevada, carried a whisper of unease, as if the desert itself had decided to send him a message. The letter began simply, "If you value forgotten truth more than comfort, follow the name Charles Bennett." History omitted him for a reason. There was no signature, only a small drawing of a pickaxe intersecting a serpent. Below it, a date, 1884. Holler frowned. He had covered ghost towns, mining collapses, missing persons. Nevada was full of them. But he had never once encountered that name in the archives. That was strange. In a state obsessed with its gold rush past, someone like Charles Bennett, called a baron, should have left a trail of ledgers, ownership papers, or photographs. Yet a quick search through the state mining registry turned up nothing. Not a single reference. He tried the university library, then the Nevada Historical Society, then the Carson City Records Office. All the same, no Charles Bennett, no Bennett Mining Company, nothing. It was as if the man had never existed. That night, Holler sat alone in his apartment overlooking the Truckee River, the letter spread out before him under the warm hum of a desk lamp. The air outside was dry, crisp, the scent of sagebrush drifting through his half-open window. He poured himself a glass of cheap bourbon and thought of all the times he'd dismissed conspiracy stories. Erased names, hidden legacies. Every historian had their share of myths, but something about the tone of that letter, it wasn't madness. It was warning. The next morning he drove south toward Virginia City, where the old silver veins had once pulsed with fortune and death in equal measure. The ghost town had been preserved as a tourist relic now, but in the corners, untouched by kitsch and souvenir shops, true history still clung to the air. He walked through the old assay office, its wooden beams warped, its scales long rusted. A local caretaker, an old man with a whiskey-red nose and cataract eyes, asked if Holler was with the papers. When Holler nodded, the man's expression shifted, half wary, half expectant. "You're chasing Bennett, aren't you?" he asked, lowering his voice. Holler froze. "You've heard the name?" The caretaker gave a dry chuckle. "Heard it? Some folks used to whisper it like a curse. Then they stopped whispering altogether." He leaned closer, his breath thick with tobacco. "You won't find him in books. He paid to vanish, every record, every print, every story." "Why?" Holler asked. The man tapped the side of his nose. "'Cause of what he did to those miners out near Gold Creek. That's where you'll find your answers, if you don't lose yourself first." Gold Creek. Holler wrote it down. The caretaker gave no more details, only muttering something about the desert keeping its own dead. Later, when Holler returned to his car, he found a second letter wedged under his windshield wiper. Same handwriting. "They won't let you print it. But you can still find the truth." Attached to it was an old photograph, black and white, of a mining camp, rows of tents, wooden carts, a distant mountain ridge. In the lower corner, written in faint graphite, was the name Bennett Mine No. 3. That night, Holler enlarged the image digitally. It was grainy, but one detail stood out. The miners in the photo all faced the camera, except one figure at the far end. He was turned slightly away, wearing a dark suit instead of work clothes, his face obscured by shadow. Something about that silhouette unsettled him. It wasn't just that the man didn't belong, it was that the shadow seemed deliberate, painted over or smudged out, as if someone had wanted him invisible. The next day, Holler took the photo to his editor, Susan Park. She had the skeptical patience of someone who'd seen 1,000 unsolved mysteries come and go. She studied the image, frowned, and set it down. "Looks like a hoax," she said. "People doctor these things for clicks. There's no record of any Bennett operation. You'll be chasing ghosts." "Maybe that's the point," Holler replied. "Even ghosts leave evidence," she said flatly. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the miners, about the erased man, about the voice in that first letter. Someone who wanted this story told, but feared the consequences. And then he remembered something the caretaker had said. He paid to vanish, that phrase lingered. Paying to disappear wasn't new. Men had done it before. But erasing an entire workforce? That was something else entirely. Holler drove east the next morning into the desert. The road stretched endlessly, a silver ribbon cutting through ochre plains and ragged hills. The silence out there was immense, pressing, ancient. He stopped at a rundown gas station near Dayton, asked the attendant if he'd ever heard of Bennett. The man hesitated, then shrugged. Old name. My granddad used to talk about him, said he owned more land than the state itself. Then one day, gone. Whole camp too, poof. Poof? Holler repeated. Dust storm, explosion, curse, depends who you ask, the attendant said. But my granddad swore it happened the same night the stars disappeared for 3 hours. Holler tried to laugh, but something about the man's calm delivery gave him pause. Later, as the sun sank over the red horizon, he reached the outskirts of a dry gulch marked only by a rusted sign half buried in sand. Bennett's Crossing. He got out, camera in hand, scanning the emptiness. The wind rose suddenly, whispering through the sagebrush like 1,000 unseen voices. And for just a moment, as the last light faded, Holler thought he saw movement far in the distance, something metallic glinting beneath the sand, like the edge of a buried rail track. He stepped forward, heart pounding. The desert swallowed the sound of his footsteps, and somewhere beneath that endless silence, history waited, patient, buried, and angry. By dawn, the desert had turned the color of rusted copper, the kind of morning light that erases the night, but not its memory. James Holler stood by his car, his boots sinking into the soft crust of sand near Bennett's Crossing, feeling the faint tremor of wind across the dry valley. The glint he'd seen the evening before was gone now, buried again under shifting dunes. It was as if the land itself had reconsidered revealing its secret. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath him was waiting to be unearthed. He drove into Dayton, the nearest town with anything resembling an archive. The historical museum sat beside an old feed store, its glass door marked by sun-faded lettering, preserving Nevada's frontier past. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and dust, with display cases full of silver coins, rusted picks, and sepia portraits of men who once believed the desert could make them kings. The curator, a soft-spoken woman named Elsie Crandall, greeted him with polite curiosity. When he mentioned Charles Bennett, her smile faltered slightly, the way a candle flickers in sudden wind. Bennett? She repeated quietly, glancing toward the back office. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken in years. I'm trying to verify if he existed at all, Holler said. Mining records, land deeds, anything. Elsie hesitated, then gestured for him to follow. They moved through a narrow corridor lined with shelves of ledgers, bound in cracked leather. She ran her fingers across the spines like someone recalling a tune from memory. Most of our records go back to 1860, she said softly. But there's one box that doesn't belong. It was donated decades ago with no paperwork. We never catalogued it. The box sat on the floor of a storage room, coated in fine dust. The lid bore only a single letter, B. Inside were papers so fragile Holler had to use gloves to lift them, ledger pages, torn maps, and receipts written in iron gall ink. One small book caught his attention immediately. Account book number 7, C. Bennett, proprietor. His pulse quickened. The pages were filled with names of miners, supply lists, and payment tallies, all written in a careful, deliberate hand. But near the back, the pattern changed. The handwriting became frantic, uneven, as though written under duress. Several names were crossed out, each followed by the same notation. Absent, no trace. And then, one date stood out, August 14th, 1884, circled in red ink. The same hue as the mark on the first letter he'd received. Beneath it, a single line scrawled across the page. Tunnel sealed. Order carried. Where did this come from? Holler asked, his voice low. Elsie adjusted her glasses. No one knows. It appeared in our shipment from a closed museum in Carson City. Some called it cursed. The director refused to display it. He said that book was the evidence. Evidence of what? She met his eyes for a long, uneasy moment. Of something Nevada decided never happened. Holler photographed the pages, every note and signature, before gently closing the book. When he looked up, Elsie was staring at the window, her expression distant. My grandfather was a miner, she said softly. He told me stories of men who vanished without graves. They said the earth took them back, but maybe it wasn't the earth. He left with the ledger under his arm, its weight oddly heavier than paper should allow. The highway stretched before him like a dry river of asphalt, the sun hard and blinding. Back at his apartment in Reno, he spread the photos on his table, cross-referencing them with digital archives. Nothing matched. The miners' names weren't in census records, death registries, or union lists. It was as if they'd been erased with precision. That night, unable to sleep, Holler zoomed into one of the ledger photographs. In the margin beside the final entry, faintly scratched in pencil, were the words, "Ledger 8 hidden at the office." The office? Bennett's? If ledger number 7 existed, there must have been others. Holler began tracing Bennett's last known locations through land deeds tied to anonymous holdings. Most led back to the outskirts of Gold Creek, now little more than a sunken scar in the desert. He decided he'd go there himself, even if the trail led nowhere. 2 days later, he was standing at what locals called the Sink, a dry basin surrounded by rock formations that looked like melted towers. The wind carried a faint metallic scent, like the aftertaste of rain on iron. Using coordinates derived from one of Bennett's maps, he began searching the base of a cliff where an old wooden structure had partially collapsed. It took an hour before he noticed a warped door half buried under rubble. Carved faintly into its surface was the same serpent and pickaxe symbol from the first letter. Inside, the air was cool and stale. Holler switched on his flashlight. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling like skeletal ribs. Dust motes shimmered in the beam of light. Against the far wall stood a small desk, its drawers swollen shut by time. He forced one open, revealing a pile of brittle papers, most disintegrated at his touch. But beneath them lay a second ledger, smaller than the first, its cover engraved with faint initials, CB. He opened it carefully. The entries were shorter, coded almost. Dates without explanations, coordinates without landmarks. But near the end, one phrase was written repeatedly, as though Bennett had been rehearsing a confession. "The earth remembers what men conceal." Then Holler noticed something tucked in the back sleeve, a folded note, newer than the rest, written in modern ink. It said only, "Stop digging." Some history was buried for mercy, not shame. He froze, the beam of his flashlight trembling over the page. Someone had been here before him, recently. Outside, the wind picked up again, hissing through the canyon like a warning. Holler pocketed the ledger and stepped out into the fading light. In the distance, a dust cloud rose along the horizon, too straight, too steady to be natural. A vehicle heading his way. He hurried to his car, heart hammering. As he started the engine, his headlights swept across something half buried in the sand. A rusted mining helmet, its lamp still intact, glass cracked but unbroken. He reached for it, brushing away the dust. Inside the rim, barely visible under corrosion, were 2 letters scratched by hand, B.M. Bennett Mine. The headlights behind him grew brighter. Whoever was coming wasn't stopping. Holler floored the accelerator, kicking up a storm of dust as he sped down the empty highway. The ledger on the seat beside him. In the rearview mirror, he saw the vehicle slow by the cliff, headlights lingering over the exposed doorway he'd left open. Then, after a moment, it turned off its lights and stayed there, unmoving. By the time Holler reached Reno again, night had deepened. He parked behind his apartment, his hands trembling as he locked the doors. He placed the ledger in a metal filing box and slid it under his bed. But even as exhaustion pulled at him, sleep refused to come, because now, for the first time, the silence felt watched, and somewhere beyond the edge of the city lights, the desert waited again, ancient, patient, and full of names it would not yet release. By the time Holler returned to Gold Creek, the landscape had changed again. The desert was a shifting animal. It never stayed the same twice. The wind had flattened the tracks of the mysterious vehicle, and the doorway he had discovered was now completely sealed under a new blanket of sand. Only the faintest outline of disturbed ground marked where the past had whispered to him. He felt the same chill he always did when the desert tried to hide something, as though the land itself had a memory and a will to protect it. He stopped at a roadside diner on the outskirts of Fallon, a squat building with peeling red paint and a flickering neon sign that read Dusty's Grill. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions. A handful of truckers sat in silence, their faces weathered, their boots heavy with dust. Holler ordered a black coffee and unfolded his notebook, the edges of Bennett's second ledger peeking from his satchel. He'd spent the past week trying to decode the symbols inside, the coordinates, the single recurring phrase, "The earth remembers what men conceal." He'd traced some of the entries to real locations, old mining camps now swallowed by sand. But one set of coordinates led to a blank zone on modern maps, just north of a ghost town called Dry Wells. Every historical reference to the area stopped abruptly after 1884, the same year circled in Bennett's first ledger. Dry Wells? The waitress, a thin woman with sun-spotted arms and a smoker's rasp, looked up sharply when Holler mentioned the name. "You don't want to go poking around there, mister. Folks say the ground there don't just take what falls, it keeps it." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You mean sinkholes?" She shook her head. "I mean voices. My granddad was a prospector. He said at night you could hear men calling from under the sand. Thought it was wind at first, but—" She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Ain't no wind that calls your name." Holler didn't answer. He was used to local folklore, but something in the woman's tone wasn't performative. It was the kind of fear that lingered from generation to generation, the kind that carried a memory no one dared to write down. Later that afternoon, he drove toward Dry Wells. The terrain grew wilder, more hostile, the highway narrowing until it became a single lane of cracked asphalt. He followed the coordinates from the ledger, each number pulling him deeper into the emptiness. When he finally stopped, the sun was low, staining the sky orange and violet. There was nothing around him but dunes and fractured rock, no structures, no signs of human life. And yet, half buried near a dry riverbed, he saw a wooden post jutting from the sand. Hanging from it by a single rusted nail was a metal tag, the number 47 stamped into its surface. He brushed it clean and felt a jolt of recognition. The miners' names in Bennett's ledger had been numbered, each with a corresponding payment code. Number 47 was listed as Thomas H. Weller, absent no trace. He took a photo, then noticed a depression in the ground beside the post, a faint circular hollow, maybe 20 feet wide. Kneeling, he scooped away a handful of sand. Beneath it, the soil felt different, packed hard, almost clay-like. Then, just as he leaned closer, a voice startled him. "You shouldn't dig there." Holler spun around. An old man stood a few yards away, wrapped in a faded denim coat and a straw hat nearly collapsing at the brim. His face was leathered from years of sun, his beard streaked white. In his right hand, he held a walking stick carved with odd markings. His eyes, however, were sharp and alert, the color of desert glass. "Name's Arlen Grieve," the man said, approaching slowly. "Used to be a miner long time ago. You're from the papers, aren't you?" Holler nodded warily. "You know about Bennett." The old man gave a short, humorless laugh. "Know him? Son, my daddy worked for him. Or thought he did. Till the night the earth took everyone." Holler motioned to the hollow. "What happened here?" Grieve stared into the distance for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and deliberate. They were digging too deep. The mine was supposed to hit a new vein of quartz gold, but what they found instead was water. Not the kind you drink. Black water, heavy with mercury and death. The men started getting sick. Skin burns, teeth falling out. Bennett told them to keep working. Said it was just fever from the air. He leaned on his stick, the wind tugging at his coat. One night there was a noise like thunder underground. Then the ground started moving, swallowing everything. My daddy was on shift that night. Never came home. Next day, Bennett sealed the tunnel and paid the sheriff to call it a collapse. Then he burned every ledger, every record, and left Nevada for good. Folks who asked questions disappeared too. Holler's chest tightened. "How do you know all this?" Grieve smiled faintly, revealing a row of uneven teeth. "Because I found what he missed." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin-bound notebook. Its pages were cracked, covered in cramped handwriting. "This was my daddy's. Found it behind a false wall in our cabin. It talks about the mine, the sickness, the explosions. And it names Bennett. Says he wasn't just mining gold. He was extracting something else, something he called shadow ore." "Shadow ore," Holler repeated. "Don't ask me what it was," Grieve said. "But after that night, Bennett ordered the mine flooded. The men who tried to stop him, well, they're still out there." Holler took the notebook gently. The handwriting was messy but legible, full of frantic accounts, descriptions of strange lights underground, of water that burned the skin, of metal singing like thunder. On the final page, a half-finished sentence trailed off. Bennett says we'll all be rich if we keep quiet. But the ground don't want this opened. The ink stopped abruptly, smudged as though the writer had been interrupted. Holler looked up, but the old man was already turning to leave. If you're wise, Grieve said, you'll stop chasing ghosts. They don't rest easy here. Wait, Holler called. Where can I find the rest of your father's notes? Grieve paused at the edge of the ridge. Ain't no rest of it. Just what you're holding. But if you go back toward the ridgeline, you'll find what's left of Bennett's old office. Buried under half a century of sand. Then he was gone, swallowed by the golden haze of sunset. Holler stood there for a long time, the wind whipping dust around his legs, the notebook clutched in his hands. The desert was silent again, but the silence felt different, denser, as if filled with memory. When he finally returned to his car, he noticed something lying on the driver's seat. A single sheet of yellowed paper folded neatly. His heart stopped as he opened it. The handwriting was identical to the anonymous letters he'd received before. Mr. Holler. You found the voice of the desert. Listen closely. Next, you'll need the compass. There was no signature, only the drawing of the pickaxe and serpent, slightly darker this time, ink fresh. He looked around. The ridge was empty. Somewhere behind him the sun disappeared, and the desert slipped into shadow once more. The next stage of the story had begun. Night had long fallen by the time James Holler reached his small apartment in Reno. The windows were streaked with desert dust, the kind that clung to glass as though it wanted to stay. He set Grieve's notebook and the 2 Bennett ledgers on his desk, their presence filling the room with an inexplicable heaviness. Outside, the city hummed softly, unaware that its own soil hid a graveyard of history. Holler lit a lamp and began reading again, his eyes burning from exhaustion. The miners' notes spoke of tunnels that echoed without sound, of vibrations beneath their boots when no machinery ran, of voices that seemed to seep from the rock itself. One entry chilled him. He says the ore sings before it dies. Another read, the ground moves when no one's there. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd inhaled mercury fumes, hallucinated. But the repetition of certain words, singing, moving, watching, gave the impression that the men believed they had uncovered something alive. Bennett's ledgers, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic near their final pages. Dates no longer aligned with payroll, and entire columns were replaced by symbols that looked mathematical, but didn't match any known notation. As Holler stared at the pages, he noticed something new. On the inside cover of the second ledger, pressed faintly into the leather, was a compass rose, 4 points with the letter E replaced by a tiny serpent shape. The same serpent from every letter. It wasn't ink. It was embossed like a seal. He took a photo and zoomed in. At the very center of the rose was a minuscule engraving, 33°14'N, 117.02 W coordinates. The next morning, he confirmed the location. It was near the remains of Bennett's Ridge mine, east of Gold Creek. The site was supposed to have been sealed off decades ago due to instability, but now, staring at the map, Holler realized something. Those coordinates matched the last entry from Grieve's father's notebook. He packed a camera, a flashlight and 2 bottles of water, then headed back into the desert. The road to Bennett's Ridge was little more than a scar of gravel winding through low sandstone cliffs. The further he drove, the more civilization fell away. No phone service, no radio, only the steady hum of the engine and the whisper of wind against metal. Eventually, the road ended in a plateau overlooking a vast depression of sand and rock. It looked like the crater of some ancient wound. At the center stood the remains of an old mining shack half buried, its roof caved in. Holler approached slowly. The silence was immense, almost liquid. His footsteps sounded swallowed. Inside, the shack smelled of rust and time. Rusted shovels hung from the walls, and on the floor lay the remnants of wooden crates stamped with Bennett's initials. He brushed away sand from one crate's lid and found the word Echo stenciled faintly across it. He pried the lid open with a piece of metal. Inside were dozens of small glass jars, their corks sealed with black wax. The contents shimmered faintly, even in the dim light, powdered gold mixed with something darker, denser. He lifted one carefully. The mixture seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with his own breathing. For a moment he thought he saw movement within, but when he blinked it was still again. At the back of the shack, half hidden under collapsed boards, he found a trap door. The hinges were rusted, but when he forced it open, a wave of cold air spilled out, a smell like wet stone and machinery. He descended carefully. The ladder creaked under his weight, each rung coated in years of dust. The tunnel below was narrow, supported by beams blackened from some old fire. His flashlight beam caught something carved into the wall. August 14th, 1884, the date. The day the miners vanished. Further in, he found signs of panic frozen in time, discarded helmets, bent picks, and a single lantern still standing upright on the tunnel floor. Its wick had long since turned to powder, but beneath the silence, Holler thought he heard something faint, an irregular echo like a slow drip of water. He followed the sound deeper until the tunnel widened into a chamber. There the beam of his flashlight froze on something that made his breath catch. A minecart sat in the center of the room, its contents buried under hardened silt. Carved into the wall behind it was a large, deliberate symbol, the serpent wrapped around a pickaxe. Beneath it, letters etched roughly into stone. "We are the gold." Holler's heart pounded. He took photos quickly, the flash illuminating fragments of metal embedded in the walls, belt buckles, helmet pieces, perhaps even bone. Then the drip he'd been following stopped. For several seconds there was only stillness. Then, from somewhere deep in the passage behind him, a new sound began, soft at first like sand sliding, then louder. Footsteps. He turned off the flashlight, heart hammering, crouching behind a support beam. The footsteps were deliberate, echoing in the narrow corridor, accompanied by the faint metallic rattle of equipment. Someone was down here. He waited, holding his breath. The sound came closer, then stopped just beyond the edge of light. "Mr. Holler," a voice said calmly. "You've gone far enough." It was a man's voice, steady, measured, and not entirely unfamiliar. The silhouette that appeared wore a brimmed hat and a long coat. When the flashlight briefly flickered from the man's own hand, Holler saw the glint of a sheriff's badge, though the design was antique, the star shape dulled by age. "Who are you?" Holler demanded. "Someone who's been trying to keep this place quiet for a long time," the man said. His tone carried neither threat nor warmth, only exhaustion. "Bennett's story isn't yours to tell. People died here," Holler said, his voice rising. "You can't erase that," the man sighed. "You think he wanted to erase them?" "He was trying to protect the rest. The miners found something they shouldn't have. What you're standing in isn't a mine, son, it's a burial vault." The words hung in the air like dust. Before Holler could reply, the flashlight in the man's hand flickered and died, plunging them both into darkness. Then came the sound again, faint vibrations through the ground like a low hum building in waves. Holler's chest tightened. The air thickened, full of static. He grabbed his own light and turned it on, but the tunnel was empty. The man was gone. Only his badge remained, lying on the floor. The hum grew stronger, deepening into a rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from beneath his feet. Holler staggered back toward the ladder, the beam of his flashlight trembling across the walls. Just before climbing, he glanced back one last time. The jars in the open crate now glowed faintly, their black gold dust swirling as if stirred by an unseen current. Then everything went silent again. By the time he emerged into daylight, the sun had already begun to rise. He looked out over the desert, dazed. The wind blew softly across the sand, carrying the faintest whisper that might have been his imagination or something else. He didn't know if it was memory or warning, but the words echoed clearly in his mind. "We are the gold." When he returned to his car, a folded envelope waited on his windshield. No stamp, no handwriting, just the embossed serpent symbol on its seal. Inside was a single note. "Next time you dig, bring a witness." James Holler didn't sleep for 2 nights after leaving Bennett's Ridge. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the symbol carved into the tunnel wall. The words "We are the gold" burning like scripture behind his eyelids. He heard the echo of the sheriff's voice, the metallic vibration in the ground. When he tried to convince himself it was all some elaborate hoax, something staged by opportunists or fringe historians, the memory of those jars shimmering under the earth returned to him with impossible clarity. He knew what he'd seen. What he didn't know was why any of it had survived, and who wanted it kept secret. He needed proof, something tangible that could tie Charles Bennett to the site, to the men who vanished, and to whatever he'd been mining that wasn't just gold. So he went to Carson City. The Nevada State Archive of Historical Photography, was housed in a modest, sand-colored building near the old Capitol grounds, run by a man named Leon Halbrook, an archivist whose passion for the 19th century bordered on obsession. When Holler explained that he was researching forgotten mining barons, Halbrook's eyes lit up behind thick glasses. "Forgotten," he said. "Son, out here they're all forgotten." Holler smiled faintly. "Maybe not all." Halbrook led him to a dimly lit room lined with fireproof cabinets. Inside were thousands of glass negatives, each carefully labeled by location and date. He began flipping through drawers labeled Gold Creek, Carson Diggings, and Comstock. Then, at the very back, he found a folder marked only Bennett Properties, unverified. The photos inside were astonishing. Panoramas of mining camps, workers posing proudly beside rail carts, lines of tents stretching across the valley. But something strange caught Holler's eye. Every group photo had a conspicuous gap, an empty space where a man might have stood between two others, as if someone had been carefully cut out of the frame. "See here," Halbrook said, adjusting his spectacles. "That space. Always the same place. You can even see the outline in some prints. Whoever owned these wanted someone gone." Holler leaned closer. The cutouts were neat, razor precise. But in one photo, whoever had done the editing missed something. Jay's shadow, long and distinct, fell across the ground where the missing man should have been, the shape of a wide-brimmed hat, and beside it, the glint of a chain, perhaps from a pocket watch. "Can we restore this?" Holler asked. Halbrook nodded slowly. "I can try. These old emulsions hold more than people think." They scanned the image under infrared light. As the machine processed, faint traces emerged. An outline, a suit jacket, then a hand holding a cane. Slowly, the face began to surface, blurred but undeniable. Charles Bennett. The name whispered itself in Holler's mind before Halbrook could even speak it aloud. The image that formed was of a man in his 40s, tall, sharply dressed, eyes piercing beneath the brim of his hat. There was something unsettling in his posture, a stiffness as though he were posing for something more than a photograph, like a verdict. Halbrook frowned. "You recognize him?" "I think so," Holler said. "But this isn't supposed to exist." He took digital copies of every image. When he compared them later to public records, the discrepancy was obvious. In state archives, Bennett's name had been systematically removed from every document, his company's deeds reattributed to others, even his mines renamed. But now the photos proved otherwise, proof that Bennett was real and that someone had deliberately erased him. That night back in Reno, Holler spread the photographs across his desk. He pinned them side by side on his corkboard, tracing patterns with red string, the locations, the dates, the same circle of faces recurring across years, and always at the edge Bennett's blurred silhouette. Then, in the bottom corner of one image, something else caught his attention. Her tall building behind the miners bore a painted sign, Bennett & Co. Mining Supplies, East 1879. Except in every other copy of that photo he'd seen online, that sign didn't exist. It had been blacked out, replaced by blank wood. Whoever had sanitized Bennett's history hadn't just erased the man, they'd edited the very landscape. He sat back, the realization settling like dust. Someone with power had scrubbed him from history, and they'd done it decades before digital manipulation existed. As he stared, the air in his apartment felt heavier, like the desert itself had followed him home. He glanced at the window. Across the street, a dark SUV sat idling under the streetlight. No plates, no movement. He turned off the lamp, waited. 10 minutes passed. The SUV didn't move. Then from his phone a notification blinked. Unknown number. One new message. It was a photo. A digital copy of the very image he'd just restored, Bennett's face visible. But someone had altered it again. Now under Bennett's portrait, a line of text read, "The man in the photograph never died." Holler's skin prickled. He stared at the screen, half expecting it to vanish. Then another message arrived. "You have what's left of him. Keep digging." His hands trembled slightly as he locked the phone. He moved to the window, but the SUV was gone. Only tire tracks glistened faintly under the orange glow of the lamp outside. He didn't know who was sending the messages. The same person who'd warned him. The same one who'd left notes with the serpent and pickaxe. Or someone else entirely. Unable to rest, he printed one of the restored photographs and examined it under bright light. The miners behind Bennett, wore numbered tags around their necks, 47, 52, 53, the same numbers listed in the ledgers. Beneath Bennett's cane, half obscured by sand, was a rectangular metal object. Holler zoomed in until the pixels blurred. It looked like a small box, perhaps a recorder or early device. He remembered the note from the ledger's back sleeve. Ledger 8 hidden at the office. But what if Ledger 8 wasn't a book? What if it was a recording, a confession sealed in time? He cross-referenced the photograph's background with modern satellite images. The mountain range behind the miners still existed, though erosion had changed its face. The coordinates pointed to a region near Carson Valley, now privately owned. And according to county records, that land had recently been purchased by an anonymous trust registered under a single name, C. Bennett Holdings. The name shouldn't have been possible. But there it was, legally documented, filed 6 months ago. The next day, Holler drove to Carson Valley. The property was fenced, marked with weathered no trespassing signs. Through the wire, he could see the remains of an old mansion. Its roof collapsed, its walls veined with vines and sand. The wind carried the faint jingle of loose tin and the dry rattle of grass. He slipped through a gap in the fence, camera ready. Inside the crumbling foyer, the air was heavy with dust and silence. On a marble fireplace, cracked and blackened, hung a portrait nearly devoured by mold. He brushed the grime away and stepped back. Charles Bennett stared out from the canvas, his eyes identical to the man in the restored photo. But someone had slashed the painting across the chest, as though trying to destroy the heart. On the floor beneath it lay a small circular object, an old brass compass cracked down the middle. Inside its lid, a faint engraving caught the light. Ledger 8. He opened it slowly. Inside the compass was a hollow cavity, and within that cavity a wax cylinder, the kind used for phonographs in the late 1800s. Carefully, he lifted it into the light. Scratched across its surface in a trembling hand were 3 words, "My final account." Holler's heart pounded. The confession. He didn't notice the sound of boots behind him until a shadow crossed the light. "Put it down, Mr. Holler," a voice said evenly. He turned. The man from the mine stood there again, the one with the old sheriff's badge. Only now Holler could see his face clearly, and the impossible truth made him freeze. It was the same face from the restored photographs, aged, but unmistakable Charles Bennett, alive. For a long moment, James Holler couldn't breathe. The man standing in front of him, dust in his hair, coat torn at the sleeve, eyes burning with something older than fear, wasn't a ghost, wasn't a hallucination. The light from the broken windows revealed a face lined with years, but undeniably the same one that stared out from the restored photographs. The same jawline, the same severe gaze, only tempered now by fatigue. "You're supposed to be dead," Holler said quietly. Charles Bennett didn't move. He stepped closer, his boots grinding against the debris-strewn floor. "That's the point, Mr. Holler. I've been dead a very long time." Holler's pulse raced. "That's not possible." "The photographs, the ledgers, those are from the 1880s. Bennett gave a faint, humorless smile. "History's a poor accountant. It keeps what it pleases." He reached out, his gloved hand steady. "Give me the cylinder." Holler clutched the small wax tube tighter. "What's on it?" "My confession," Bennett said simply. "Or what's left of it. You wouldn't understand it out of order." "You mean there are more?" "There were 8, Bennett replied. "Only 1 survives." His eyes softened for the first time. "Please, it's safer if it's destroyed." But Holler shook his head. "If this tells the truth about what happened to those miners, it deserves to be heard." Bennett's expression hardened again. "Truth has a way of killing more people than lies." Before Holler could answer, headlights swept briefly across the broken windows, the sound of engines echoing outside. Bennett turned sharply toward the noise. "They found us," he muttered. "So you have to leave." "Who?" "The ones who buried me," he said. "And they'll bury you too if you don't listen." He stepped closer, pressing something into Holler's hand, a small tarnished key. "Carson City. Museum storage vault. Use this before they do." "Bennett, wait." But the crash of a door exploding inward cut him off. Holler dove for cover as armed figures flooded the ruined foyer, men in unmarked desert fatigues. A flash of light, a deafening burst of sound, and when the dust cleared, Bennett was gone. By the time Holler staggered outside, the sun had dipped below the ridge. The SUVs that had arrived were gone too, their tracks already half erased by the wind. Only the compass and the wax cylinder remained in his satchel, the key cold in his palm. 2 days later, Carson City buzzed with a quiet kind of chaos. Word had spread that the State Museum was auctioning off a collection of unclaimed frontier artifacts, miners' ledgers, gold assay tools, and items recovered from sealed mines. Holler knew it couldn't be coincidence. Someone was cleaning house. He arrived at the museum's back entrance just as bidders began gathering in the grand hall. Men in suits, women in desert hats, collectors and historians murmuring over display tables. The air smelled faintly of brass polish and money. The auctioneer, a smooth-voiced man in a cream jacket, tapped the microphone. "Lot 32, he announced. Assorted mining relics, provenance uncertain. Includes compass fragments, correspondence, and a sealed metal container." Holler froze. Compass fragments. He slipped into the back row, watching as a small wooden box was brought forward and placed under the lights. Through the glass lid he could see it, a second compass identical to the one he'd found at Bennett's mansion. Its lid bore the serpent and pickaxe seal. "Opening bid at 500, the auctioneer began. Before Holler could raise his paddle, a man 3 rows ahead lifted his hand. Tall, immaculately dressed, grey hair tied back neatly. His suit was too modern, his expression too composed. When his eyes flicked briefly toward Holler, recognition flashed there, cold and knowing. Holler hesitated, then counted. 1,000. The man raised an eyebrow. 2. The numbers climbed rapidly. Other bidders dropped out, sensing something unspoken at stake. Finally, when the price reached 10,000, Holler forced himself to stop. The man smiled faintly, then raised his hand once more. 15,000, he said smoothly. No one else challenged him. The gavel fell. Sold. The man approached the stage, signed papers, and collected the box. As he turned to leave, he passed close enough for Holler to smell faint tobacco on his coat. "You shouldn't chase ghosts, Mr. Holler," he said softly without looking directly at him. "They tend to chase back. How do you know my name?" Holler demanded. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're not the first reporter to think Bennett was a story. But you might be the last." Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Holler followed him through the museum's maze of corridors, down a stairwell that led to the lower vaults. But by the time he reached the storage level, the man was gone, and the air smelled faintly of ozone, metallic and sharp. He turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hall stood a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The key Bennett had given him fit perfectly into the lock. The tumblers clicked. Inside, the room was dark, lined with shelves of unlisted artifacts, items too inconvenient to display. The hum of an old ventilation system echoed like a sigh. On the center table sat another small box, its seal identical to the one auctioned upstairs. Beside it lay an envelope marked simply "For the journalist." Holler opened it. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, written in the same careful hand as the old letters. "Ledger 8 is not sound, it is memory. The truth you seek is not in what I did, but why they made me vanish." Below the words was a single coordinate set, this time pointing north, to an area outside Tonopah, the Lost Echo Mine. He pocketed the letter, then opened the second box. Inside was a device unlike any phonograph he'd seen. Brass, circular, with a slot for the wax cylinder. A nameplate read "Edison Prototype, 1884. His hands shook as he slid the cylinder into place and wound the crank. The machine sputtered, hissed, and then came alive with a faint, crackling voice. "If anyone hears this is Charles Bennett. The mine was never gold. It was an experiment." Holler froze. Bennett's voice continued, halting, distorted. "The investors, the ones in Washington, wanted mercury extraction, but the veins were unstable. They told us to use the ore that hummed. We didn't understand, until it started answering back." A long pause. "Then, I sealed them down there to stop it. I thought I buried it with them. But it—" The recording cut off with a hiss. Holler stood in silence, the weight of the room pressing against him. He looked down at the machine, the wax still spinning slowly. Then, faintly from the speaker, came one last whisper, almost too quiet to catch. "Don't dig the echo mine, it's awake." He stepped back, pulse hammering. The lights flickered. Somewhere above, the muffled sound of voices echoed down the stairwell. Someone was coming. Holler grabbed the recording, the compass fragments, and fled through the rear exit, into the cold Nevada night. The city around him glowed gold under streetlights, but every shadow seemed alive now. Every sound too sharp. When he finally reached his car, he caught sight of his reflection in the window, and for a fleeting instant, another figure stood behind him in the glass. A tall man in a hat, eyes sharp and unblinking, but when he turned, there was only the dark. He didn't sleep that night, nor the next. By the time dawn broke over the Sierras, he knew where he had to go next. The Lost Echo Mine. The road to Tonopah wound like an old scar through the desert, a strip of grey laid across miles of red and gold earth. James Holler drove in silence, the voice of Charles Bennett still looping in his head, crackling, broken and unfinished. It was an experiment. They wanted mercury, but the ore hummed. He played those words again and again, trying to find meaning between the static. The wax cylinder sat in the passenger seat, sealed inside its brass housing, reflecting slivers of morning light. The closer he came to the coordinates, the quieter the world became. The radio faded into static. His phone lost signal miles before he reached the outskirts of the old mining district. What remained of Echo Ridge, once a prosperous satellite settlement during the gold rush, was now a graveyard of wooden beams and rusted rail tracks. A windstorm had torn through years ago, collapsing what little remained of the town's structure. When he parked at the end of a dirt road, the landscape stretched endlessly ahead, heat already shimmering over the horizon. In the distance, half buried by sand, a sign leaned against a dune. Echo Mine Co-Property. Keep out. He walked toward it, the crunch of his boots swallowed quickly by the silence. Near the sign, the sand sloped downward into a depression filled with scattered timbers, the remnants of what once had been an entry shaft. The coordinates on his map matched perfectly. Bennett's voice haunted every thought. I sealed them down there to stop it. What had it been? A geological reaction? A gas pocket? Or something more? The shaft was half collapsed, but a narrow side tunnel reinforced by warped planks seemed passable. Holler tied a flashlight to his wrist and began his descent. The air grew colder with every step, and soon the daylight behind him narrowed to a pinprick. At 20 feet, the tunnel widened slightly. He paused, breathing shallowly. His light caught markings on the wall, symbols carved into the rock repeating in a circular pattern. The serpent coiled around a pickaxe. But beneath the carvings, new symbols appeared, etched deeper, almost ritualistic foreign. As he advanced, he saw the walls glimmer faintly, flecks of metallic dust embedded in the stone. Gold, perhaps, or mercury. It seemed to pulse faintly, reflecting his light in waves. Then he heard it. A faint hum, low and resonant, like the vibration of a distant machine. It came from somewhere deep below, steady and slow. He stopped, heart pounding. The sound wasn't mechanical. It felt organic, as if the earth itself were breathing. He swallowed hard and pressed forward. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, lined with collapsed beams. At its center, a large iron door was half buried under rubble. Someone, decades ago, perhaps a century, had welded it shut. On its surface was an inscription barely legible under dust, property of Bennett Company. Do not unseal. He brushed away the dirt, revealing more words scratched beneath the warning carved by hand. We begged him not to. The hum grew stronger, resonating through his bones now. Holler set down his pack, retrieved the wax cylinder and stared at the ancient door. If the recording had been made here, this was the place Bennett had tried to hide forever. He took a breath and wound the phonograph. The needle descended. For a few seconds there was only the crackle of dust and age. Then the voice returned, clearer this time, almost human in its exhaustion. If you found this, you're standing where I stood. They told me it was progress, an extraction method beyond gold, beyond mercury. But when we drilled, we found not metal, but sound. The earth spoke, not in words, in rhythm. The cylinder clicked once, then continued. Each time we struck the ore, it sang. The men laughed at first. They said it was hollow rock. But then it began answering back. Patterns, repetition. It learned the strikes. It mimicked us. Holler froze, the air growing heavier around him. The hum in the ground pulsed in sync with Bennett's recorded voice. I sealed them in, the confession went on, trembling now. It wasn't mercy. It was containment. They didn't die in the collapse. They became part of it. You cannot dig here again. You cannot wake it. Static hissed through the chamber. Then, faintly, "If you've come for truth, bury this place deeper. If you've come for gold, God help you." The cylinder ended with a final metallic scrape. Holler stood motionless. His flashlight flickered once, twice. Then he realized the humming hadn't stopped with the recording. It had grown stronger, echoing through the chamber walls. The dust at his feet trembled faintly. Something shifted behind the iron door. He stumbled back, pulse racing. The hum rose into a deep vibration that filled the air like thunder. Pebbles fell from the ceiling. Sand spilled from cracks above. He turned and ran for the tunnel entrance, his light swinging wildly. The sound followed him, steady, alive, pulsing like a heart. When he finally burst into the sunlight, gasping, the ground behind him gave a low groan, then fell silent again. The desert returned to stillness, as if nothing had moved at all. He collapsed beside his car, chest heaving, staring at the dark opening in the sand. The compass on his dashboard trembled faintly, its needle spinning in slow, confused circles before pointing east, toward the horizon, toward Carson City, toward whatever had started this more than a century ago. He sat there until dusk, the cylinder heavy in his hands. The confession was real. The voices of the miners, the erased history, the humming earth, all of it tied to Bennett's guilt and whatever he had tried to silence. But as the first stars appeared above the Nevada desert, Holler realized something chilling. The voice on the recording hadn't faded completely. When the final words ended, a faint noise had continued under the static, a low, rhythmic pulse. It matched the sound still coming from beneath the sand. He started the car, watching the dunes in his rearview mirror as he drove away. For a long time, he thought he saw faint lights flickering deep below the surface, like lamps burning where no air should exist. By the time he reached the highway, his phone buzzed. A single notification, no signal, no number. Just one message, "You've heard it now." It's awake again. Holler gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He looked toward the dark horizon, toward the city lights faintly shimmering miles ahead. Whatever Bennett had sealed wasn't done, and now neither was he. The hum never left James Holler's mind. Even after he'd driven 100 miles from the mine, showered off the desert dust, and sat alone in his Reno apartment with the television on for noise, the vibration remained, a faint, inner frequency that pulsed behind his ribs like a borrowed heartbeat. It wasn't tinnitus and it wasn't memory. It was something deeper, as if the sound from that buried chamber had found a place inside him and refused to stop resonating. The wax cylinder sat on his desk, wrapped now in a thick cloth, its brass casing sealed with electrical tape. He hadn't touched it since that morning in Echo Ridge. Still, when he passed near it, the hum seemed to strengthen, like the air itself remembered what it had heard. At dawn, he received a call. "Unknown number. This is Susan," said a familiar voice, his editor from the Nevada Sentinel. "You're all over my desk this morning, Holler." "What have you gotten yourself into?" "What do you mean?" he asked. "There's a cease order from the State Historical Commission on your last article draft. Something about unauthorized excavation and possession of restricted artifacts. They're threatening prosecution." Holler sat up straight. "I didn't publish anything yet." "Well, someone thinks you did," she said. "And they specifically named you in connection with a man called Charles Bennett." His mouth went dry. "Susan, listen to me carefully. If anyone from the commission contacts you, don't answer their questions. And don't come to my apartment. James, are you in trouble?" He hesitated, glancing at the wrapped cylinder. "I think the trouble's older than me." He hung up before she could reply. Outside, the city was bright and windless, the kind of day that made Nevada look harmless. Holler drove toward Carson City again, retracing the map Bennett had left behind, until he reached the edge of town where the old administrative buildings gave way to fenced government lots. One in particular drew his attention, a low concrete structure with no nameplate, just the code NVD Archive 4 painted in fading white. He parked, waited until a delivery truck exited, then slipped through the half-closed gate. Inside, the corridors were sterile and quiet. He walked with the calm of someone who didn't want to look like he was trespassing. Room 214 was marked Archive, Restricted Mining Records. Holler used a small pry bar from his coat pocket to slip the lock. The lights hummed weakly when he flipped the switch. Rows of filing cabinets stretched before him, labeled by date. He found 1884. Most of the folders were empty, names crossed out, papers missing. But at the back, wedged between two unmarked binders, he discovered a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The same serpent and pickaxe symbol pressed into it. He tore it open. Inside were typewritten transcripts dated 1947, each marked Confidential, Department of Interior. The heading read, Project Echo Post-Closure Report, Visa. Pages detailed a congressional inquiry into an experimental mineral resonance phenomenon discovered in Nevada during the 1880s. The report referenced auditory geological activity, physiological disturbances among workers, and mass disappearance events in sealed shafts. One sentence froze him. Primary investor Charles Bennett assumed sole responsibility for site containment. Following his disappearance, the Echo Ridge site was sealed under federal supervision and struck from mining records by order of Senate Resolution 24B. A list of names followed. Politicians, financiers, law enforcement. All had signed a non-disclosure agreement titled The Pact of Silence. Beneath the signatures, one line was added in pen long after the typewriter ink had faded. If the resonance returns, protocol is to erase all inquiry. Holler's breath caught. He understood now. The cover-up wasn't just about corporate greed or tragedy. It was about something the government had deemed too dangerous to exist. Bennett hadn't been erased because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd found. He copied the files with his phone's camera, then turned to leave. But as he stepped into the hallway, two men in grey suits appeared at the far end. Their expressions were neutral, almost polite. "Mr. Holler?" one of them asked, voice smooth. "We'd like you to come with us," he bolted, down the stairs, through the back exit into the sunlight. The men shouted, but he was already running across the lot toward his car. As he drove, he caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of one of them raising a phone to his ear. Within minutes, black SUVs appeared in his side mirrors. He didn't head for Reno. Instead, he turned south toward a friend's ranch near the Walker River, where he could lie low. The desert rolled endlessly beside him, the hum still deep in his chest. That night, as he sat by the window of the ranch's small guest room, he opened his laptop. He uploaded every photo, every document, every recording he'd collected so far to a cloud drive under an anonymous server. If they came for him, the evidence would live on. But before he could close the screen, a new email appeared. No sender, no subject. Just a message body containing a single line. "You can't publish what doesn't exist." Attached was a photograph. It showed the storage room from the museum, the one where he'd played Bennett's cylinder. Only now it was empty. The table, the phonograph, the box, all gone. As if they had never been there. He stared at it until the computer screen dimmed. At dawn, someone knocked at the door. He froze, heart hammering. Slowly he opened it. It wasn't the agents. It was a woman, no more than 30, wearing a long brown coat and carrying a leather satchel. Her hair was dark, her eyes clear and grey, the same shade as Bennett's in the old photographs. "Mr. Holler," she said softly. "You don't know me, but you've been looking for my great-grandfather." Holler blinked. "You're a Bennett?" She nodded. "Clara Bennett. My family was told never to speak his name. But I saw your article drafts before they were pulled. Then you know what he did." "I know what they said he did," she replied. "But there's more you need to understand. My family kept one thing the government never found." She opened her satchel. Inside was a small black cylinder, identical to the one on Holler's desk. "Ledger 9, he stared at it. "There's another recording." Clara nodded. "The last one. It explains everything." Before he could speak, the sound of tires crunching gravel reached them from outside. Headlights cut across the yard. Two black SUVs rolled to a stop near the gate. Clara closed the satchel quickly, her eyes sharp. "We can't stay here. How did they find us?" "They always find the hum," she said. The words sent a chill through him. She grabbed his arm. "There's a place north of Pyramid Lake. Old communications bunker. My grandfather used it during the war. We'll be safe there for a while." Holler looked at her, then at the wrapped cylinder on his desk, and knew there was no choice. He gathered both recordings and followed her out into the desert night. As they drove away, the horizon behind them glowed faintly, not with light but with movement, as if the sand itself was stirring again. The hum returned, low and patient, reverberating through the chassis of the car like the pulse of the earth itself. And in the darkness ahead, the past was waiting to finish its sentence. They drove through the night, headlights slicing the dark as the desert stretched endlessly around them. The hum, so faint at first it could have been the vibration of the car, grew steadier with each mile. James Holler tried not to look at the compass on the dashboard, but it kept spinning erratically, unable to decide which way was north. Clara Bennett drove without speaking, her expression rigid with focus, her eyes occasionally darting to the rearview mirror. The black SUVs had vanished hours ago, yet neither of them felt free. Pyramid Lake appeared on the horizon at dawn, a grey mirror beneath a bruised sky. The air carried the scent of mineral and salt, sharp and metallic. Clara turned off the main road onto a gravel path that led toward a cluster of low hills. "To the bunkers just ahead," she said quietly. They parked behind a rock formation and carried their packs toward a rusted metal hatch, partially hidden by tumbleweed. Clara knelt, brushed off the sand, and turned an old wheel lock that squealed in protest. The door opened with a breath of stale air. Inside, the bunker was surprisingly intact, 2 rooms carved into the earth, lined with steel plating and old equipment. Rusted radio transmitters sat on shelves beside war-era documents. A lantern hung from a nail in the ceiling, casting dim yellow light. "This belonged to my grandfather," Clara said. "He worked on radio encryption during the 40s. When he died, my father kept the key. I used to play here as a kid." Holler placed the 2 cylinders, Ledger 8 and Ledger 9, on the table. "You said your family kept the last one hidden." "Why?" Clara hesitated. "Because of what he says in it. My father listened once. Afterward, he locked it away and told me if anyone ever came looking for Bennett again, I should destroy it." "But you didn't," Holler said. She looked at him with a small, wry smile. "Curiosity runs in the blood, I guess." They set up the old phonograph from Holler's pack. It crackled faintly when powered by the portable battery. Clara took a deep breath, then placed Ledger 9 onto the spindle and lowered the needle. The cylinder hissed for a few seconds. Then Bennett's voice emerged, calmer this time, aged, almost tender. "If you are hearing this, then the Earth has not kept its silence. Perhaps you found Ledger 8 and ignored its warning. That is human nature. I would have done the same." Holler and Clara exchanged a look. "I must tell you," Bennett's voice continued, "the mine was never about gold or mercury. Those were excuses. The investors from Washington were searching for an energy source, one that vibrated, one that sang. They believed the desert could be harnessed like a tuning fork for the Earth itself. When they struck the echo vein, the air changed. The ground began to respond. The miners thought it was the sound of wealth. I knew it was something else, something alive beneath the strata, a rhythm that matched the human pulse." Static swallowed his next words, then returned. "We took samples, sent them east. I don't know what became of them, but I know they learned to reproduce the resonance. I tried to destroy the site. That's when the pact was made. Silence in exchange for survival." Another pause. His tone shifted, softer, regretful. "To my descendants, Clara, if that name still endures, understand that I was not evil. I tried to end what they began. But history writes monsters from those who challenge its authors." The cylinder clicked once, and a new sound replaced his voice, a deep, steady vibration that made the walls of the bunker tremble. The lamp flickered. Holler reached for the stop lever, but Clara caught his hand. "Wait," she whispered. The hum deepened, aligning with the faint pulse they'd both felt since the mine. Then, through the vibration, Bennett spoke again, barely audible. "The resonance is bound to the soil. If it returns, it means they dug again. And if they dug again, then the pact has been broken." The recording ended. The silence that followed wasn't quiet at all. It felt full, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Clara exhaled shakily. "He wasn't lying," she murmured. "He really tried to stop it." Holler nodded slowly. Then someone reopened the mine. "Maybe recently," she frowned. "Who would do that, after everything that happened?" He reached into his bag and pulled out one of the documents he'd photographed from the government archive, the Project Echo report. At the bottom of the final page was a list of modern divisions responsible for ongoing geological containment. One of the names was underlined, Echo Dynamics Corporation, Private Partner Contractor. 2004 present, that's who, Holler said. Clara took the page, her eyes narrowing. They're the same people who bought the land under C. Bennett Holdings. The ones who've been digging again. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the desert, not from the sky but from underground. The walls of the bunker quivered. Holler killed the phonograph's power, but the hum didn't fade. "What's happening?" Clara whispered. Holler pressed his palm to the metal wall. It was warm. "They're drilling. They've hit it again." The light bulb overhead flickered violently, then shattered. For an instant, the bunker was plunged into darkness. Holler fumbled for his flashlight, and when the beam steadied, he caught sight of a fine golden dust drifting from the ceiling. It shimmered as it fell, tiny metallic flecks like the powder he'd seen in the jars at Bennett's Ridge. Clara coughed, covering her mouth. "What is this?" "Run," Holler said, grabbing the cylinders. "If it's from the vein, it's not safe." They stumbled out through the hatch into the open desert. The dawn sky had turned a strange shade of copper, as if reflecting light from below the horizon. The ground trembled once, then again, rhythmically. From the direction of Echo Ridge, a plume of dust rose high into the air, too perfect to be natural. "They reopened it," Clara whispered. "They actually reopened it." Holler turned to her. "Then we exposed them. All of it, the pact, the experiments, the mines. We take this story public before they bury it again." She shook her head. "You don't understand. My family's been hunted for generations to keep this quiet. If you release it now, they won't come after just you. They'll come after everyone who reads it. That's what they count on," Holler said. "Fear keeps the truth buried." Clara stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "If we're doing this, we do it my way. There's a radio array north of the lake. My grandfather used it to broadcast test signals. It's still connected to shortwave frequencies. We can use it," Holler blinked. "To do what?" "To make Bennett's confession public," she said. "Every station, every channel that still listens to the old frequencies." He hesitated, staring back at the glowing horizon. "And what if it wakes the rest?" Clara looked out toward the desert, where the dust plume now shimmered like gold in the rising sun. "Then maybe it's time Nevada remembers what it buried." As they drove toward the array, the hum followed them, faint, rhythmic, steady. But now beneath it, Holler thought he could hear something else. Not just the earth this time. Voices, hundreds of them, layered and distant, as if the miners of 1884 were singing their way back into history. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, heart pounding. For the first time, he understood what Bennett had meant in his final confession. The earth doesn't forget. It only waits for someone to listen. The desert dawn broke heavy and low, red light spilling over the sand like diluted blood. Clara drove fast along the service road north of Pyramid Lake, her fingers clenched tight on the steering wheel. The hum beneath the earth had steadied into something almost mechanical now, rhythmic and deep, like a heartbeat amplified through stone. James Holler stared through the windshield, unable to shake the sense that the road itself was vibrating. Every few seconds, the fine dust on the dashboard lifted, floating in the air before settling again. "Do you feel that?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded. "It started last night. I felt it through the floor of the bunker. It's spreading. You think it's the drilling?" "It's what they woke up." They didn't speak after that. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the hum beneath the tires and the static of a dead radio signal. The road climbed toward a cluster of old communication towers, 3 rusting spires braced against the wind, half swallowed by dunes. They looked abandoned, but when Clara parked beside the lowest one, Holler saw faint light through a cracked door in the small control shed. Inside, the air smelled of metal and old wiring. Equipment from another era crowded the space, shortwave dials, stacked receivers, a wall of analog meters still faintly alive. A generator coughed in one corner, running on what sounded like its last breath. Clara moved through the clutter with practiced hands, flipping switches until a low hum filled the room. "My grandfather used to transmit here," she said. Signal bounced off the mountains. He said it could reach halfway across the state. Holler set the 2 wax cylinders on the desk. "You're sure it'll work?" Clara met his eyes. "You wanted to publish the truth." "This is publishing," Holler hesitated. He thought of Susan Park, of the confiscated archives, the empty museum room. Every time he'd gotten close, someone had erased the evidence within hours. There was no guarantee this would be different, but if they could get the confession broadcast publicly, it would exist beyond deletion. The truth would be out. He nodded slowly. Let's do it. They set up the phonograph beside the microphone. Holler steadied Ledger 8, the first confession cylinder, and slid it into place. As Clara tuned the frequency, the static in the speakers turned from hiss to heartbeat. Transmission ready, she said. When you're ready, start the recording. Holler took a breath and pressed play. The crackle of the wax filled the room, followed by Bennett's trembling voice. The mine was never gold. It was an experiment. It sang before it died. The speakers buzzed as the words carried out into the open desert. Clara adjusted the frequency, routing the signal through every available channel. Static flared, then cleared again, spreading Bennett's confession across an invisible network. For a moment, the desert outside seemed to listen. Then as the final words echoed, "If you've come for truth, bury this place deeper." The lights in the tower flickered. A violent vibration rolled through the ground, knocking Holler against the wall. Clara grabbed the transmitter controls. Something's interfering with the signal. The generator screamed, its tone rising sharply, before dying with a pop. The room plunged into silence. What was that? Holler shouted. Clara stared at the radio's needle, which was spinning wildly. It's not interference. It's feedback. Something's broadcasting back. Outside, the desert began to shimmer. A faint golden mist rose from the sand, swirling in patterns too deliberate to be wind. Holler stepped to the door, transfixed. The dunes looked alive, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the same frequency Bennett's voice had carried. He turned back to Clara. "Turn it off!" She pulled the plug, cutting power to the tower. The hum outside didn't stop, it grew. The ground throbbed like a drum beneath their feet. Then abruptly it ceased. Total stillness. Holler looked out the door again. The golden haze was gone, as though it had been inhaled back into the earth. He exhaled shakily. "Maybe we overloaded it." Clara didn't answer. She was staring at the dead transmitter. We weren't the only ones sending a signal. She pointed to a line of text flashing faintly on one of the receivers, an incoming transmission code. "Government band marked Echo Prime response active." "They heard us," Holler whispered. Clara grabbed the cylinders. "We need to leave." They ran to the car just as an approaching rumble filled the air. Engines coming fast. Dust plumes rose on the horizon. Holler threw the cylinders into the back seat, and Clara slammed the car into gear. The first convoy of black SUVs crested the ridge seconds later, sunlight glinting off their windshields. "They'll try to cut us off," Holler said. Clara veered sharply off-road, the car bouncing violently across the dunes. Behind them, the SUVs split into formation. One of them pulled closer, flashing lights that weren't police issue. A voice crackled from its loudspeaker, metallic and calm. "Return the property and you will not be harmed." Clara pressed harder on the accelerator. "They're lying." The chase tore across the basin, dust swallowing the sky. Holler clutched the dashboard, trying to steady the cylinders. Terrified one might shatter. Ahead, the remnants of an old freight railway cut across the valley. 2 rusted rails leading toward a half-buried trestle bridge. "Hold on," Clara shouted. She swerved hard, sending the car up onto the rails just as one of the SUVs clipped their rear bumper. Metal screamed, sparks burst across the sand. The bridge loomed ahead, half collapsed over a dry riverbed. "Clara," Holler shouted. "You can't make that." "Watch me." The car hit the broken edge, airborne for half a breathless second before crashing onto the other side. The impact threw Holler against the window, shattering glass. The engine coughed, sputtered, but kept running. Behind them, the lead SUV skidded, teetered on the brink, and fell into the dry ravine below. The others stopped short. Clara didn't slow down until the highway reappeared miles later. The car rattled, wounded but alive. Holler looked at her. Dust streaked her hair, sweat beaded her brow, but her eyes burned with fierce resolve. "You just declared war on whoever's been burying this," he said. She gave a bitter laugh. "No, you did. The moment you broadcast his voice." Holler looked at the horizon, where the desert shimmered faintly, golden dust rising again in slow spirals. Somewhere out there, under the shifting dunes, something vast was moving, something that had waited a century for its echo to return. "We made the truth public," he said quietly. "We can't stop now." Clara nodded. "Then we go to the press, the Gazette. I know someone who won't back down." They reached Reno by nightfall. The Nevada Gazette offices were mostly dark, except for the glow of computers in the newsroom. Susan Park was waiting at Holler's desk, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Whatever you did," she said, "you just crashed our servers. We've been getting thousands of duplicate audio files. Your broadcast, Bennett's voice, uploaded by random sources from all over the state." Holler froze. "What do you mean, duplicate files?" "They're identical," Susan said. "Same audio, same timestamps, but no origin point. It's like the transmission cloned itself. Every digital platform we use has it now." Clara stared at the monitor. The resonance carried it. "The what?" Susan asked. "It's not just sound," Holler said softly. "It's memory. The Earth's frequency. It stores what it hears. And now it's speaking back." As if on cue, the lights in the newsroom flickered. From the speakers of every idle computer came a faint vibration. Bennett's voice distorted, looping through static. "The mine was never gold. Never gold." Susan stepped back, eyes wide. "What is that?" Clara looked at Holler. "It's spreading." Outside, the streets of Reno glowed with the usual neon shimmer. But underfoot, the hum had returned, steady, rhythmic, ancient. And somewhere beyond the city, deep in the Nevada desert, the miners of 1884 were no longer buried in silence. The storm did not announce itself with lightning or thunder. It began with vibration, a low droning pulse that rolled beneath Reno's streets, shaking window panes and causing the neon signs along Virginia Street to flicker, as if the city itself had developed a heartbeat. At first, the residents assumed it was an earthquake, a tremor rolling off the distant Sierra. But the shaking did not fade. It throbbed, a deep metronomic sound that came not from above, but from beneath. James Holler and Clara Bennett stood at the newsroom window of the Nevada Gazette as dust began to rise from the desert beyond the western hills. The hum that had haunted them since Echo Ridge was louder now, echoing through every surface. Phones buzzed on desks with garbled emergency alerts. "Seismic anomaly detected. Seek shelter." Susan Park burst from her office, her face pale. "It's not an earthquake," she said, holding up her tablet. "They're saying there's pressure under the dry basins. Air displacement, like a series of cavities collapsing." Clara's eyes went wide. "They've broken the containment." Holler turned to her sharply. "Echo dynamics?" She nodded grimly. "They've been drilling since we fled the bunker. They've hit the main chamber, my great-grandfather's vault." The lights flickered again, the bulbs rattling in their sockets. A long metallic moan rippled through the floor, like the sound of steel bending deep underground. Holler grabbed his camera bag and slung it over his shoulder. "We have to go." Susan stared at him. "Go where?" "You're not seriously thinking of driving toward that." "I need to see it," Holler said. "If this is the end of the story, I need to record it." Clara was already heading for the exit. "He's right. Whatever's happening out there, if we don't witness it, they'll erase it all over again." They drove west into the desert, the car buffeted by wind that grew stronger with every mile. The horizon darkened into a shifting wall of dust and light. Holler had never seen a storm move like that. It pulsed in waves, rising and falling in rhythm with the hum. The air shimmered gold. By the time they reached the outskirts of Echo Ridge, the entire basin was convulsing. Massive vents of dust and sand erupted from the ground, spiraling into the air like geysers. The old mining structures were gone, buried or shattered, but the hum was deafening now, so strong it vibrated through their bones. Clara pointed toward the center of the valley. There! Through the chaos, they saw the remnants of Echo Dynamics' drilling operation. Steel towers half collapsed, floodlights swinging wildly. Vehicles were overturned, their doors flung open. Workers ran in every direction, their movements jerky, panicked. From the center of the site, a plume of golden dust shot skyward like a column of light. Holler grabbed his camera and stumbled out into the wind. Sand slashed his face, and static electricity crackled through the air, raising the hairs on his arms. The sound was everywhere, deep, layered, almost orchestral now. "Not a hum, not a machine." A voice. "James," Clara shouted, barely audible over the roar. She pointed to the column of light. "Look!" Shapes moved within it, shadowy outlines, human in form but fluid, as if made of dust and memory. Dozens of them, hundreds, the vanished miners. Their silhouettes rose and fell within the glow, drifting like smoke, their hands reaching upward. Holler felt his throat close. "They're still here." Clara nodded, tears streaking her dust-caked cheeks. They never left. He trapped them in the resonance. The ground split open near the drill site, a wide fissure tearing through the sand. Holler and Clara stumbled backward as a wave of heat rolled up from below. From the chasm came a sound so deep it seemed to rearrange the air, a single harmonic tone that shook the clouds above. The golden dust turned violent, spiraling into a cyclone that reached for the sky. Suddenly, a voice boomed through the noise, not Bennett's but something older. Distorted through 1,000 echoes, "We are the gold." The words pulsed through the storm, rattling the valley. The miners' silhouettes disintegrated into the light, merging with it until the column became blinding. Holler shielded his eyes. "Clara, we have to move." But she wasn't looking at the storm anymore. She was staring at the compass in her hand, the one her ancestor had engraved. Its cracked glass glowed faintly, the needle spinning faster and faster before stopping dead, pointing not toward the storm, but toward the north. She looked up at him. "He built another vault." "What?" "My great-grandfather. He said he sealed them in to stop it." But if this wasn't the only sight... Her words were lost in the rising wind. The storm roared, swallowing the valley. Holler grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the car. Behind them, the drill towers collapsed one by one, their steel beams twisting like wire. When they reached the ridge, he turned for one last look. The entire basin was glowing now, the golden light spreading outward like veins under the skin of the desert. The hum pulsed louder, and then silence. A moment later, the light imploded. The valley fell dark again, the air thick with dust. They waited, breathless. Then slowly the wind began to settle. The hum was gone. Clara slumped against the car, trembling. It stopped. Holler scanned the valley with his camera. Everything was still. The Echo Ridge site was a crater now. Flat, smooth, lifeless. The storm clouds above began to drift apart, revealing the first stars of evening. He looked at her. "Did we end it?" She shook her head faintly. "Or just bury it again." They drove back in silence. When they reached Reno hours later, the power was out. The city was eerily calm, as though holding its breath. On every radio channel, static hissed softly. Then, as Holler parked outside the Gazette, a familiar sound came faintly through the speakers. Bennett's voice, thin and distant, speaking the same words that had started everything. "The earth remembers what men conceal." Holler turned off the ignition. The hum did not return, but the silence that followed was no comfort. He looked at Clara. She was staring at the horizon, her expression unreadable. "We stopped the storm," he said softly. "No," she whispered. "We reminded it we're still listening." In the distance, lightning flickered, not from the clouds but from the desert floor, illuminating the horizon in faint gold. Whatever had been buried was no longer asleep. It had simply changed its rhythm. The following morning, Reno woke beneath a quiet sky. The storm had ended, but the city felt hollow, like a theater after the play has closed and the actors have already left. Roads were choked with dust, windows filmed with golden residue that shimmered when touched by light. Radios returned to life one by one, their static clearing into faint, confused chatter about power surges, communication failures, unexplained electromagnetic interference. Not one official report mentioned the word mine. James Holler sat at his kitchen table, the same wax cylinders that had changed his life resting beside his cooling coffee. Clara Bennett stood by the window, her face reflected faintly in the glass as she stared out toward the desert. She hadn't spoken much since they'd returned, but Holler could sense her unease. "They'll explain it away," he said quietly. "Government cover story. Fault line activity. Maybe a chemical explosion from Echo Dynamics. By next week, it'll be forgotten." Clara turned slowly. "That's what they said in 1884. He looked at her. She wasn't angry, just tired. "You think it's starting again?" "I think it never stopped," she said. "My great-grandfather tried to hide it, not end it. He thought if he buried the evidence, people would forget. But history doesn't die when you hide the witnesses. It just rewrites itself." She walked to the table and placed a folded piece of paper beside the cylinders. Holler recognized the parchment at once. Aged, brittle, with faint embossed lettering, Project Echo Final Memorandum. "Where did you find that?" "In the car," she said, "tucked under the seat." "You didn't put it there." He shook his head. "No." Clara unfolded the paper carefully. The top section was typed in fading ink, a summary of containment protocol. But what caught their eyes was the handwritten note at the bottom, scrawled in hurried penmanship. If the Nevada resonance persists, redirect containment to Ridge Site B. Transfer records to Federal Archive under false title Geological Anomalies, Bennett Phase 2. No public disclosure permitted. Holler frowned. Ridge Site B? Where is that? Clara traced her finger along the bottom corner, where coordinates were faintly written. Her eyes widened. That's not Nevada, she whispered. That's Utah, near the border. He stared at her. They moved it. They tried to, she said softly. They moved what they couldn't destroy. She folded the paper again, sliding it into her coat pocket. The resonance wasn't just a natural phenomenon, James. It was a discovery they replicated, transferred. My family's curse didn't end in the desert. It spread. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call, Susan Park. He answered, bracing for her usual skepticism, but her voice was shaky, distant. James, you need to see this. What happened? 2 men came to the Gazette this morning. Federal credentials, no names. They confiscated every drive, every printed file related to Bennett. They said it was part of a misinformation audit. I tried to stop them, but they already knew about the broadcast. Did you keep a copy? Holler asked. I did, she said. But when I checked the backup servers, everything was gone. Not erased, rewritten. The files are still there, but they all say the same thing. What? She paused. They say the recording doesn't exist. Static swallowed the line for a moment, then went dead. Holler tried calling back, but the phone displayed signal interference. He set it down slowly, looking at Clara. They're cleaning house again. Clara nodded grimly. Then it's happening exactly the way it did to him. That night they drove east. The desert stretched wide and silent, its scars faintly luminous under the moonlight. Holler couldn't shake the feeling that the earth itself was listening again, waiting. He thought of Bennett's last words on the recording. If you've come for truth, bury this place deeper. They stopped at an abandoned rest station halfway to the border. The air was cold, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. Holler set up his laptop on the hood of the car and opened the last saved file from the broadcast. To his astonishment, it loaded perfectly. Bennett's voice began to play, faint but clear, exactly as before. They told us to use the oar that hummed. We didn't understand until it started answering back. Then, as the recording continued, a section Holler had never heard before emerged. New words spoken softly, as if the wax itself had unlocked another layer. History will erase me, Bennett said, but the truth has never been afraid of silence. If anyone finds this, know that I tried to undo what we unleashed. I failed, and so will you unless you choose not to dig, not to listen. The ground must stay mute. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of the wind. Clara exhaled slowly. He added that after the pact. He knew someone would try again. Holler stared at the dark horizon. Do you think he was warning us or asking for forgiveness? Both, she said. He tried to destroy himself to save the rest of us. But people like us, we don't stop when told to. That's the curse of curiosity. He smiled faintly. I guess that makes us historians and sinners both. As they packed up, Holler looked back once more toward the west. Far beyond the black silhouette of the mountains, a faint rhythmic glow pulsed against the horizon, soft and golden, barely visible. It might have been distant lightning or perhaps something deeper, something stirring beneath the sand once more. When they reached the Utah line hours later, dawn was breaking, and the radio came alive with news. The headlines were cautious. Nevada storm disrupts mining operations. Officials cite natural gas flare. No mention of Bennett, of Echo Ridge, of the column of light seen by hundreds. Holler switched off the radio. For they've already rewritten it. Clara watched the sunrise. Then we'll write it back. He turned to her. You mean publish again? She shook her head. Not yet. We find Ridge Site B first. We see what they moved. He hesitated. And if it's worse? She looked at him with the weary calm of someone who had stopped believing in safety long ago. Then we stop them the way my great-grandfather tried to. For a long while they drove in silence. The sun rose higher, the desert around them glowing faintly gold. Holler felt the pulse beneath the tires again, a slow, distant rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He looked out at the endless horizon and thought about the missing pages of history, how they weren't really lost. just waiting to be found by someone reckless enough to look. And somewhere, deep below the Nevada sands, the hum returned, not loud, not angry. Just a reminder. The earth remembers. The Utah border greeted them with silence and wind. The sand here was different, finer, lighter, like flour that refused to settle. It drifted across the highway in silver ribbons, erasing tire tracks as quickly as they appeared. James Holler and Clara Bennett drove through the dawn like two shadows running from their own story. The trunk carrying the last relics of the past, Bennett's wax cylinders, the broken compass, and the single page that had escaped the government's fire. The coordinates on that page led them north, toward a range of pale limestone hills that shimmered faintly in the morning haze. "This is where Ridge Site B should be," Clara said, studying the map spread across her lap. "They used a natural cave system as cover. If they replicated the experiment, it'll be under there." Holler nodded, his jaw tight. The car climbed a gravel path that wound around the base of the hills, the tires crunching softly. After an hour, they reached a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond it, the earth had been carved open, a gash of machinery and concrete half swallowed by sand. The sign on the gate was new, the paint still sharp. U.S. Geological Survey, Hazardous Research Area, authorized personnel only. Geological Survey, Holler murmured. "That's how they're hiding it now." Clara's eyes swept the perimeter. "There's a guardhouse, but no guards. Whatever happened here, it's been abandoned fast." They slipped through a hole in the fence, the hum of the desert louder now, as if following them. A tunnel yawned at the center of the site, reinforced by modern steel beams. The air that drifted out was cold, metallic, heavy with the scent of ozone. Holler switched on his flashlight. The first 100 meters were lined with equipment, abandoned computers, crates stamped with federal logos, cables coiled like snakes. Farther down, the tunnel walls began to change. Smooth concrete gave way to raw stone, streaked with veins of faintly glowing mineral. The same golden hue they had seen at Echo Ridge. The light didn't flicker. It pulsed. "God," Clara whispered. They really did it. They reached a wide chamber, circular, with a single metal platform at its center. Above it hung a massive suspended device, a framework of steel and copper rods, surrounding a black sphere that seemed to absorb the light around it. On a nearby console, a monitor still blinked weakly, running on reserve power. Holler stepped closer, scanning the screen. "Project Echo 2, phase continuation, resonance stabilization." Clara moved toward the sphere. "This is what they built from his research." "Don't touch it," Holler warned. But she was already studying the markings on the metal housing, symbols identical to those carved into the mine walls. He tried to stop them, but they didn't need him anymore. They used what he found. The hum deepened. The sphere's surface rippled faintly, as if something beneath it was waking. Holler lifted the camera, filming. "Clara, we should leave." "Whatever's in there." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "So you wanted the truth, James. This is it. This is what he died for." The ground trembled. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The sphere began to glow from within, threads of light spidering across its surface like veins. Then a sound emerged, not mechanical but alive, a deep harmonic voice that resonated in their bones. "We remember." The air quivered, thick with invisible pressure. Holler staggered backward, shielding his camera. The voice deepened again. "We were promised silence," Clara shouted over the roar. "It's the miners. The resonance stored their memory. They're still part of the ore." The lights on the console flared red. A warning blinked. Containment failure, core integrity breach. The hum turned to a rising pitch. Holler grabbed Clara's arm. "We have to shut it down." She pointed to the control panel. "Manual override, there." They ran, the floor vibrating beneath their feet. Holler slammed his palm on the emergency lever, but it refused to move. The metal burned to the touch. The sphere above them expanded, light spilling across the chamber walls, painting everything gold. Then, through the blinding glow, another voice spoke. Softer this time, weary, familiar. "Clara." She froze. "James, did you hear that?" The voice came again, trembling, human. "Clara, you must end it." She turned toward the sphere, tears streaking her face. "Great-grandfather?" Bennett's voice echoed from within the resonance, calm but fading. "You can't silence what was made to remember, but you can choose what remains. Destroy the memory." The light flared, searing bright. Holler looked at the panel. Her secondary switch blinked red, labeled Field Purge. He met her eyes. "If we do this, everything, records, evidence, the resonance, it all goes." She nodded. "Then maybe this time history can rest." Together they pulled the switch. For a heartbeat, the world went white. Then came the sound, not of explosion, but implosion. The sphere collapsed inward, folding its light into itself until it vanished with a single deafening crack. The air rushed out of the chamber, and then silence. When Holler opened his eyes, the lights were dead. The hum was gone. Only the faint hiss of settling dust remained. Clara knelt beside him, trembling but alive. "Is it over?" he whispered. She looked around. The walls no longer glowed. The ore veins were dull, lifeless rock. "I think—" "Yes." They climbed out into the dawn, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the hills. Behind them, the tunnel entrance collapsed, sealing the chamber forever. For a long time they stood in silence, watching the wind erase their footprints from the sand. Later that week, back in Reno, Holler sat at his desk staring at his laptop screen. The footage he had recorded from Ridge Site B was corrupted, blank frames, static, flickering light. Every file he tried to open displayed the same error message, "File not found." He looked to the corner of the room where the wax cylinders once lay. They were gone. Only the compass remained, its cracked glass reflecting the morning sun. Inside, the needle was still at last on his screen. A draft headline blinked, "The Nevada Gold Baron Too Evil for History Books, Charles Bennett and the Vanished Miners." He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then he began to type, not the version history demanded, but the one the desert had whispered to him. He wrote about memory and silence and the cost of truth. He wrote that some legacies aren't buried to protect the guilty, but to save the living. When he was done, he sent it to Susan with a single note. "Publish if you believe me. Forget if you don't." He closed the laptop and walked to the window. The city glowed under the late sunlight, ordinary again, unremarkable. Yet from somewhere far beyond the hills, he thought he heard it. A faint whisper carried on the wind, neither warning nor curse, just acknowledgement. "The earth remembers." Clara's voice came from behind him, gentle. "Do you think they'll believe us?" He smiled faintly. "They don't have to. The story's already written. Here it's just waiting to be found again." Outside, a gust of wind stirred the desert dust into a brief spiral before it vanished. And for a moment, just before the quiet returned, it sounded almost like distant singing, low, harmonic, and full of gold.